Welcome back to Secret Weapons, and today we're taking a look at the all-new version 2 line of pedals from Strymon Engineering. The El Capistan, the Flint, the BlueSky, and the Dig. These are, in some cases, pillars of the industry that we work inside of here. The El Cap is one of the most beloved tape machine emulations of all time. It's one of the best tape delays ever made. The Dig, for my money, is one of the best and most interesting implementations of stereo delay on the market right now. The Flint has sounds that make people shake their fist angrily at the sky that they're not included in the Strymon BlueSky. The BlueSky was such a core sound for such a specific genre, the praise and worship world, that it became a black sheep to entire other swaths of guitar players out there because it was so synonymous with a certain sound. We are looking at updates to pedals that have been around in some cases for like a decade right now. Things that have shaped entire subgenres of music, things that have kind of been the foundational cornerstones of people's pedal boards for years and years at this point. So we're here today to ask the question, these new version 2 pedals, are they worth it? Both for a newcomer and if you're somebody who has an El Cap or a Flint or a Dig or a BlueSky. Is it worth the update? Because it's not just that we have added new features here, it's also that we are seeing a new price point on these pedals. These are between $50 and $80 more per pedal over what they were with their V1 counterparts. But it's not just about price. The landscape of the pedal industry has changed dramatically in the time since these pedals came out at their various times over the last 10 years. The El Cap predates things like the Timeline, let alone the Walrus D1, the Ecosystem, and all of these other big box delays of varying sizes. The Flint and the BlueSky are swimming in a very, very crowded pool these days of stereo-capable MIDI reverbs. So in this part of the video, let's talk through a few reasons that I, off the bat, think that these still merit our time and attention in the current climate. Number one, they are wildly fast and easy to dial in. And that's not nothing in the current climate. We have increasingly complicated wet effects available to us. We're at a point now where something like the Timeline or the BlueSky actually feel somewhat accessible or excessively accessible in the face of things like the Zoya, the new LVX coming from Maris, things like that, things that get really, really meticulous. These on the other hand are amazingly straightforward. For instance, I have never played a BlueSky before this one came into the studio. I don't know how that's the case, but I've never played one. It's never been on my rig. It's never been on somebody else's rig that I've used. Never touched one in my entire life. I had a gig like 2 days after these pedals came in. I wanted to use some or all of them for the gig, and I didn't have time to get MIDI set up going into it. Literally the morning of the gig, sitting on stage, I pulled my Flint off of my board and put the BlueSky on because I needed that extra preset that the BlueSky offers you without MIDI, having that favorite switch on the left side instead of a tap or a tremolo. It took me less than a minute and a half to dial up a favorite switch sound that was like my go-to reverb for like 80% of the set. And then I was able to use the live mode for a secondary, drier, cleaner, smaller reverb alongside it. It took me less than 2 minutes to dial in 2 great reverb sounds on a pedal I had never used. And you guys know, I like a good complicated delay pedal. I like a good complicated reverb, but there is something really wonderful to being able to quickly dial in a sound, to almost effortlessly find the sound in your head and get it out in front of you in the world, that kind of thing. Number two, and this is for better or for worse, you cannot get some of these sounds elsewhere. The El Cap is the El Cap sound. For some reason, that D-tape algorithm in the El Cap with that crinkle control and everything else does not exist in the Timeline or the Volante. And trust me, I have sat down with my version 1 El Cap and my Volante for like an hour and a half trying to see how close I can get those two pedals, and there's a disconnect between those two sounds that cannot be recreated. And for a lot of people that may not matter, but if you are one of those people, and I know a lot of people are, that live and die on that El Cap tape sound, you just have to play an El Cap. And a MIDI-capable updated El Cap might be exactly what you need. And likewise, the Flint has that same thing. The 80s rack reverb in the Flint has a very specific, slow, wonderful modulation and great diffusion rate, and it just doesn't exist elsewhere. It's not in the BlueSky. It's not in any other pedal. So this is, for those sounds, your main and most versatile point of entry. Now, whether or not that matters to you, that MIDI update and everything else, that's a different story. But we're just talking through kind of like the base level reasons that these pedals are worth having a conversation about in 2022. But if those two things do appeal to you, or either of those things resonate with you in any way, let's talk about what the new updates are and why they're valuable. Update number 1, and this is pure quality of life across the board. The addition of an external TS/TRS mono stereo input control on the outside of the pedal. If you've owned an El Cap, a Flint, or any of these before and have worked in a flexible mono and stereo rig like I do, you know the hassle that is unscrewing that pedal every time you want to change a jumper because you're running it in mono or you're running it in stereo because you move it around your pedal board like I do. Having that switch above your TRS jack is a huge quality of life improvement. It's not a big thing, but it's so helpful. Number 2 is the obvious one, the inclusion of MIDI. Having full MIDI CC control as well as presets is a huge win for a lot of reasons. Obviously, if you use MIDI, you understand this to be true, but we'll get into case-by-case uses for MIDI beyond just presets as we run through each individual pedal in this video. But trust me, there are some super high-value MIDI controllable parameters that we are going to dive into in this video. They might make you want to start using MIDI for these pedals if you are not a MIDI person already. Thirdly is the overall workflow quality of life improvement on the face of the pedal. If you look at these pedals, you'll notice that a couple of them now have 6 knobs instead of the 5 standard configuration that was all of these pedals for a long time. And they are really, really smart and intuitive updates. Things like the inclusion of the spring reverb on the El Cap as its own knob is really great. The addition of a sub-menu control for pre-delay in the Flint is a really cool, small quality of life thing for being able to further refine an incredibly simple, straightforward, and great sounding reverb. The tone knob on the Dig is a big one for me. I really love the tone of the Dig. I really love it as a crisp, beautiful digital delay. Having the tone as a sub-menu thing always kind of frustrated me, and now it's right there on the face for quickly dialing in snappy, bright percussive delays, or something that low passes into murkiness and swirling dual delay greatness really quickly, which is again, a really, really wonderful addition to that pedal. And it's like an intuitive choice in terms of what to change on the face of it. And finally, the BlueSky, which I would argue has been given the most significant update in terms of quality of life knob configuration in the form of that shimmer control, which not only is now its own knob rather than a 3-position toggle switch thing, but also now controls 3 different types of shimmer depending on the reverb algorithm you are in. And I'm not a big shimmer person, and I'm gonna very rarely ever use the 5ths and octaves or the octave up shimmer modes, but what they did with the spring reverb on this one, spoilers, is really, really cool. And lastly, and I think this one cannot be understated enough, these all have preset spillover now. These, all of the new Strymon wet effects in these V2 formats have the ability to change presets via MIDI, and as long as your previous preset has been up for at least 5 seconds, you get preset spillover, which is, for those of you who don't know, preset spillover is the ability to retain the trails or the delay line from the mode you are in as you switch into a new one, preventing you from losing that trail really, really abruptly if you're making a transition in the middle of a song. And it's rarer than you might think. For instance, the Strymon BlueSky has preset spillover, but the CXM from Maris and Chase Bliss does not. The Maris Polymoon has it, but the Mkiii 7 or the GFI Specular Tempest does not. And we're talking about robust, full-featured, big box delays and reverbs, and a lot of these things don't have preset spillover. These pedals having that, to me, is a huge win and really deserves to be showcased and talked about, because that might be enough for a lot of people out there. So that's kind of the long and short of what's been done and changed to these pedals. We are now going to dive into sound samples for all of them. We're going to split each one into its own kind of two-part section. Part one is going to be a quick overview of the sound samples if you are somehow not familiar with what these pedals sound like specifically. And then part two will be the ways in which MIDI has really opened up some functionalities and some great tones that are quickly accessible. So let's go ahead and dive in. We'll give each pedal a listen, and then we'll see kind of what has been massively improved about them. And then we'll circle up here at the end and talk about kind of our verdict on the question of, is this worth it? Before we get into our sound samples, let's go ahead and talk through our signal chain and the context that we are working in. I am playing my Baum Wingman with Jabmaster pickups, so basically like chunky Jazzmaster style pickups, into the 1981 Inventions DRV, the Bondi Effects 2026 compressor, the Browne Amplification Carbon, the Bondi Sick-As Mark III, and then up through all of the Strymons in stereo, the Dig, El Cap, Flint, and BlueSky in that order. From there we go to the Ruby and the Dream as our amplifiers, basically an AC30 and a Fender amp left and right. From Universal Audio, and then we are out to our DAW, which is Luna by Universal Audio as well. For the vast majority of our sound samples, I'm going to be running the 2026 compressor and the Sick-As. So here's what that sounds like. We'll run through bridge, middle, and neck positions on the Baum. We may bring in the Flint here and there for just a tiny bit of ambience behind some of these delays, but we will mostly keep it out, and we'll keep it very subtle, but here is what that sounds like. So we're going to start things off with the Dig, and we're going to start off by running through, like I said earlier, our kind of base level sounds, and then we're going to start digging into what makes it so special to me, as well as how MIDI really opens up a bunch of really cool things in it. So let's start things off by running through the Digs, kind of type modes, as well as the tone control, the repeats, the mix, all that stuff. So we are on delay mode 1, or delay number 1 of the 2 delay lines in this thing. We'll bring in mix 2 in a little bit here, but let's just start by looking at kind of base level delay. So the Dig is interesting because the type up there, you've got your kind of high fidelity, medium fidelity, and really low fidelity. But to my ear, they all sound very, very similar. I pretty much live in that third position, that 12-bit mode, because it's got a tiny bit of crunch that I really like, but it's tough to me to tell the difference. I'm willing to guess it probably appeals a lot more to like hi-fi synth guys than it does me, but I love this pedal, so let's dig into it either way. Like I said, they're real close, but there's something a little hairy that I really love there. And likewise, that tone control, it's really subtle. Whenever I talk about the Dig to people, I talk about how it's like almost impossible to find a bad sound in it because it just doesn't give you that much control, but in a really cool way. For digital delay, I like that that's the most high end that rolls off. It just gets kind of cool and soupy, especially lower delay times with a lot of feedback like that. And simultaneously, it's really snappy in a really cool way. Okay, we're gonna bring in mix 2 here. And as you can tell, that's where things really start to get interesting with this delay. It is worth noting that typically if I'm running the dig as a single delay, I'm almost always using mix 2 as my main delay sound because you have all of your quickly accessible subdivisions right here. And delay line 1 also does have that in the form of quarter, half, and dotted eighth available as a submenu control. It's really great that you can kind of tie those two things together. I do really like a triplet playing against it like that. And being able to kind of like prioritize them separately. It's worth knowing we are currently in series mode, and that is part of the reason that we haven't touched our modulation yet. So let's get into that. Okay, we're switching over to just that dotted eighth. Okay, so the dig's delay lines can be configured in 3 different ways. Configuration 1 is series mode, which we've been on so far, wherein your dry guitar feeds delay line 1, and then your dry guitar and delay line 1 both feed into delay line 2 as kind of a single center channel delay that has stereo modulation applied to it. Second up is ping pong, which is the same general configuration of dry guitar into delay line 1 and delay line 1 into delay line 2, but with a ping pong effect applied to your delay, basically meaning that every other delay hit pans back and forth from hard left to hard right. And then thirdly, you have parallel, where delay lines 1 and 2 do not interact with each other directly in any way, but instead are panned hard left and hard right respectively. I've kind of grown to not use a ton of ping pong and parallel delay in my sound. I really like something a little bit more organic, and the Dig does this the best. So let's listen to what series in stereo sounds like, which is basically the modulation applied in stereo to a mono delay line. And so you can really hear that. It's not ping-ponging, it's not hard panning, it's a gentle thing that slowly kind of moves across your sound. Bring in that mix 1 and bring it really, really slow so you can just hear kind of that drift. And there's a reason that I love that this is the functionality here. Sometimes when you're doing those really driving, classic dotted eighth rhythmic stuff, or things that are like really like tremolo picking based, if you have stuff in the super wide, it maybe doesn't do what you want it to be doing. So for example, let's spin up a quick sound on the El Cap, and let's actually MIDI clock them together. You'll see the taps change on both pedals when they are receiving MIDI clock. So that's the Dig right there. Sometimes you want that straight up mono delay sound to really kind of punctuate that thing, because that digital delay or that dotted eighth thing, it's supposed to feel like an extension of your guitar as opposed to an ambience that exists around it. It's foundational to the part itself in a lot of ways. And the same thing if you're doing that like kind of tremolo picking thing. If you have a ton of stereo width on that, you start to lose the impact. So for example, there we go. It's cool, but you can hear a disconnect with the Haas effect moving your delay line away from your dry guitar. And same thing with that tremolo picking thing. You can really hear that dry guitar sitting in the center of your mix. But something like this, or that kind of like progressive sweeping through your center point of this, especially when you bring in that second delay line. really, really versatile. And that modulation, the deeper you go, the bigger the swing is. So within just series mode, you have 3 different mono to stereo configurations available to you. And then from there, maybe you don't want that super organic washiness. You have ping pong. And now you're hearing those solidly left and right. And again, this is still in series. Delay 1 is interacting with delay 2, which is why you're hearing it kind of like run away and jumble towards the end there. And you'll notice the modulation is just modulation now. And then thirdly, you have parallel. And this one's interesting because now you have properly left channel, right channel delay with mix 1 and mix 2, to the extent that you could take mix 1 or mix 2 all the way down and just get left channel delay. Or go really high mix on one and really low mix on the other. I don't know why you would do that, but it's an option available to you. You can get some really interesting I think this stuff kind of is really, really helpful in creating really lush, wide swell moments. Give it a little bit of reverb. Some murkiness. Yeah, some really cool moments for non-rhythmic parts can be found in that parallel mode or in that ping pong mode, to be fair. But for me, for my money, this is the sweet spot. I love that drift. It's so perfectly dialed. Okay, so what else can we do with MIDI here? There are other great implementations that we have available to us. We've got clock. We have the ability to change these. You also have the ability to bypass whether or not your dig is responding to clock really, really quickly, which we will get into the value of in just a second. But you also have access to kind of multiple subdivisions for that delay line 1. So even with clock turned off, let's turn off clock for a second, tap in our delay line 1. So that's a quarter note at 123 BPM, or I guess at whatever I tapped in on the dig. And with a click, I can go to a half note. That can also be made to be a dotted eighth as well. It's all just MIDI control on that front. You can also do some really convenient quality of life stuff with MIDI on this one. Things like killing your dry signal for like a full wet mix thing, as well as a myriad of other really cool things. Let's look at one of the things that are kind of non-traditional with the Dig that I found that I really love using MIDI. That modulation sounds really gentle, really well tuned, and really, really great. You can have MIDI clock on. Everything's kind of cruising the way you want it to. But say you want to use that modulation in a different way. I have a preset up here that resets my, that pulls up a preset on the Dig, so a PC change, as well as a command to bypass the clock and reset the time as incredibly fast, doing that. As you can see, we now have a super fast clock that is not listening to MIDI, and it's also made a bunch of other changes that with one button turns this pedal into a chorus pedal. But it gets even more impressive than that. You can use one of your kind of sub-menu controls by holding the on button. Once it blinks, I can take this time 2 over here and change it from green, which means delay time 2 is a subdivision of delay time 1, to a free mode where instead of this as a subdivision control, it's now its own independent time control. I can save that, and now I've got that chorus with mix 1. I can bring in mix 2, change the time on mix 2, bring the repeats up a little bit. So even with those changes, as you can hear, I'm still getting my chorus sound. But now I'm also getting that second delay as a delay still. And you could switch those if you wanted to. You could take that delay time 2, bring it up to 0, take that delay time 1, that kind of first in line, and have that one be your chorus, or have that one be your delay. And now you're applying a stereo chorusing effect to your delay line and your dry tone as opposed to the other way around. And with just a button, we are back to our standard delay sound again, complete with MIDI clock and everything. Yeah, I'm a really big fan of these updates to the Dig. It really pulls a lot of high-value stuff out of it. Next up, we are taking a look at our El Cap. This is, in my opinion, the most impressive showing of any of the new Strymon updates. And I think it's going to be very apparent very quickly why that is. So let's get into it. We're going to start off by looking through kind of the basic functionality of the El Cap, and then we'll start getting into some of the really, really big MIDI wins. Starting off, of course, having MIDI tap on this thing is amazing. Oh, just a really base level quality of life thing at the start. Let's turn off our MIDI clock really quick. With the old El Cap and the new El Cap, when you tap in your tap tempo, it mutes your delay trails, which I've never understood, and I don't know why it's in the new one, and I find that frustrating. So let's give this a listen and see if you can hear it. You hear that those first two taps mute your signal, and then it comes back. I've never understood why that is. I don't totally get it, but it's whatever. However, MIDI clock bypasses that problem. You'll get your those proper tape stretching moments that you've always wanted out of your El Cap but could never get. Or maybe you didn't, but either way, it's there now, which is, I am a fan of that. I like hearing my delay and not feeling like I'm gonna lose track of it if I have to tap in a new tempo. So let's talk through our kind of base level functionality on this guy. At its core, the El Cap is just a really, really excellent sounding tape delay. So let's take our crinkle, which is like kind of like the secret sauce on this guy, all the way down. And a slower delay time. Just such a great sound. With really excellent bass level modulation. Some of like the soupiest and warmest. I think it's really, really big. As well as like a really, really well-tuned low-pass filter for tape age. And those two things play into each other really, really wonderfully. It's worth noting right now, the El Cap and the Flint are my go-to sound when I want like a good like rock and roll rhythm tone, but I still need that kind of like wet channel stuff to kind of make it feel huge. You bring down that mix, you bring down those repeats, you give it a little bit of modulation, a bunch of age, and then over here, you jump on your 70s plate, keep the decay high, color way low, and all of a sudden you've got this, which is excellent. Throw on a rat. So good. Such the sound. Anyways, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Like I said earlier, this thing has this submenu control for a crinkle that I think is just magic. And it's kind of like an intermittent heavy modulation that basically represents like folds in the tape of a tape machine. Let's really crank that for a second, just because we're not going to go through all the submenu stuff on here because there's more than most, but I do want to kind of like highlight this sound. Yeah, it's something really, really special. Okay, so you basically have three main delay modes with kind of sub-menu options on this left side. You've got your fixed, which is going to be 3 different delay speeds. I'm on a dotted quarter, like a dotted eighth note as your tap tempo. Then you have your quarter and like a proper eighth. All the way up to your like super tight one. Kind of slap backy, which is not something I ever really make a lot of use of. And then you have multi-head repeats. Let's bring down that reverb a little bit more. Let's actually take it out for now. And then we'll get down to the single stuff in a second, but you also have a really great spring reverb in here as well. This is a pretty potent combo right here. Again, with no spring reverb. Yeah, it's a really cool spring. I will typically use at least a little bit of it on almost every El Cap setting that I make, just because it offers just a tiny bit of extra kind of softness around the repeats versus totally dry. Even if I'm using other reverbs alongside it, it's just that second reverb source is kind of cool. And then down here, you have single tape head, which is a variety of kind of more tape machine driven sounds. Including mode C, which is kind of the legendary mode on the El Cap. This is the sound on sound looper. And let's talk about what that is and why it's cool. It's like a very Frippertronics-y style, kind of continuously playing and listening and playing back single tape loop. Think of it basically as a very kind of like formless, organically aging looping pedal, but that doesn't have all the bells and whistles of like MIDI clocking and all that stuff. It's just a tape loop that you have a punch in and a punch out sound on, and then you just kind of like stack things on top of it as it kind of like ages and falls apart. It's often been a really kind of like mysterious aspect of this pedal, especially in the earlier days of the El Cap, because to get it to sound great requires a bunch of kind of specific things that you have to do. Like you have to go down to single, mode C, and then you kind of have to start setting a bunch of stuff. You want your wow and your flutter to be where you want them to be, your tape age to be where you want it to be. You need repeats up high. You need your mix to be nice and high as well. And then you can set your time on either side of noon, depending on whether or not you want to be able to half speed or double speed the loop you're playing. And then you tap in your kind of in point and your out point, and then you can start playing. But if your like modulation settings and all that stuff aren't all the way dialed, you're kind of, you know, up a creek. Because this thing will kind of like chew up faster than you want it to or whatever else. So let's jump back up to kind of what I would consider to be like, you know, my go-to delay sound. I've got my tape age, I've got my wow and flutter where I want them to be. I've got my tap tempo and my clock is turned on. You know, I'm dialed, I'm playing. You can hit one button now with MIDI and get all the way over to your looper and be able to splice in and out of it with your MIDI controller. immediately accessible, and then let's halftime it. Let's give it some ambience. There's no reason we can't enjoy this. And you can hear all that stuff start to chew up as it passes through that wow and flutter and that tape age over and over again. And our knobs are not representative of what's happening right now because it was all handled in MIDI. Let's take it back up. And you can capture those speed changes too, which is really cool. And then, with a touch of the button, we are back to our standard delay sounds. Super high value. Like, that sound on sound looper is like, you know, the stuff of legend. It's a lot of people's favorite thing about the El Cap, and being able to access it right there is really cool. By the way, pro tip, that splice right there, that's a MIDI CC message that is essentially just pressing and holding, or pressing down on this tap button over here. I have it set up so when I press down, it presses down on the switch, and when I release, it releases, which means in standard delay mode, I can also do runaway oscillations with my MIDI controller. You can basically control anything about this pedal that you would normally have to do by hand with your controller, which is like super, super cool. And the one other thing that I really love about MIDI El Cap is being able to quickly get from this delay sound to one of my favorite things about this, the lo-fi sound. So that is a preset where I bypass the clock. I set my time to minimum, my repeats to minimum, and then my tape age, my wow and flutter, and my crinkle are all super, super high with mix at max, basically completely killing my dry signal and instead making it this like really cool lo-fi broken cassette chorus sound. And you can really get a wealth of sounds out of that. You can get something a little bit hi-fi, but still super broken. Or completely woolly. You'll notice you're hearing it more for the headphone users. You'll notice you're hearing it more on the right side than the left side. And that's because of the way that stereo imaging is done on the El Cap and basically every Strymon delay pedal except for the Dig, which is the Haas effect. So if you want that in the center, you can run this thing in mono. Or one of the things that I have discovered is I just go over to my Flint and switch that from stereo input over to a mono input, and now sadly, I don't think there's a CC command for that hardwired thing on the back, but you know, you can't have it all. You could really like completely eat this up too by over biasing your tape machine And if you really want to go crazy with it, you can cut out a bunch of that low end using the tape age subcontrol. And now you got like a real like old-timey radio sound. All your low end, or none at all. Let's kind of go in the middle, save that sound, and then let's actually, this is a good opportunity to kind of demonstrate something. We're on that lo-fi mode right now. If you make changes that you love to something, press and hold both, and then press and hold that left one. This is for the delays until that turns blue. And now all those changes we made, we can jump over to our stock delay sound. Have our delay. Or get back to exactly what we just made. And that's the new El Cap. Wrapping up our sound samples, we are going to take a look at both the Flint and the BlueSky kind of at the same time. We'll do them separately, but this is not going to be kind of a full dedicated page on the MIDI controller to each like I did with the first two. And that's for a couple of reasons, but really just the main one being, these are fairly straightforward pedals. We talked at the start about these being easy to dial devices across the board, and that is generally true. But as you saw with the El Cap that we just finished covering, there's a lot of submenu stuff that lets you get really granular control over what you're doing. These, that's not so much the case. These are really accessible, simple, immediately good or not good, depending on what you're trying to accomplish with it, pedals. And I love that. The Flint is a 3-knob, 3-mode reverb with a 2-knob, 3-mode tremolo. Really the only complications here is there are submenu controls for if you want your reverb into your trem or vice versa. What you want your subdivisions of your tap, your optional tap on the Flint tremolo to be. And then new to the V2 is the inclusion of a pre-delay on the reverb side. Really straightforward and does not require entirely too much time and attention, but we will pull up some things that I really love on the Flint when it comes to MIDI here, including, like with these guys, as you can see, tap tempo. You have everything all locked in together. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Let's start by talking about the reverb side of the Flint. We'll kind of do an all knobs at noon thing just to start off, and we'll kind of talk through the three of them. The reverb is in 3 positions. Top one is 60s, and it is a spring. It can get really, really tight. Or it can get really, really washy. Almost like feedbacky. And that's as much as we're going to talk about it, because I don't really care for almost any spring reverb on the market. I do like this one. Out of all 3 of the springs in this lineup, I think I like the spring on the El Cap the most, which is an interesting place to be. Let's jump down to the plate, because this is one of the best plates I've ever used, and I've used a lot of digital plate emulation, and this one is a great one. So you can hear it's percussive, it's lively, but it's really, really subtle in a way that I find is not the case with a lot of really good plates. It can get really, really long. And the diffusion on it's really, really good. This color control does a lot of heavy lifting too. And And so does the mix taper. It does, the mix taper on the Flint specifically does a lot of heavy lifting. And it's really good at keeping your dry signal kind of at the forefront until you absolutely don't want it to. I find that the decay on this doesn't get really crazy long until right about here. Like, that's a decent decay time, but like even up at noon, you're getting drop off really fast, and down here it's like the smallest thing in the world. That color knob again. I love that this thing never gets that bright either. And of course goes full wet. And then thirdly, the 80s reverb, everyone's kind of standout thing on the Flint, probably mine included. And it's a rack reverb, it's an 80s digital rack, and it sounds so good. You can get really, really drifty and stay really, really beautifully under your signal with that color turned up. Or I love that that still feels very, very subtle. But if you were without it, you would notice. I think it's a really, really great one for throwing delays in front of. I think it handles big, beautiful, modulated delay really well. Oh, there we go. Let's get our stereo image back. And on the tremolo side, you have a harmonic trem, a sine wave amplitude trem, and a square wave amplitude trem. Bring that El Cap back in a little bit. This would be my favorite mode right here. The 63 tube is kind of the sauce for me. And I do really like just how much range that tremolo has in terms of its speed. And then you've got your square wave. Oh, and before we get distracted too far, you do have, like I said, access to a pre-delay. You press and hold that reverb, and you can take your color knob from 0 pre-delay to maximum, which is not a ton, but that might be something super, super useful to somebody out there. So yeah. Also handy to have and can be controlled via MIDI. Let's take that all the way back down for me. One of the things, like I said, MIDI is one of my biggest things for the new Flint because I don't need a lot of sounds, but being able to get very quickly to my plate and then straight over to my hall. And have that massive trail happening, like and not have lost that trail along the way is a really, really high value win for me. There's also something really interesting that you can do there. So you can pull up this kind of preset. Now I've got my Flint going. I pulled up the trem sound I like, a nice gentle trem with that 80s thing. But like I said, everything on here responds to MIDI CC values as well. So up here, I have a Flint ramp, which is essentially sending a speed value to the Flint over the form of a MIDI waveform, like a sine wave. So if I hit this, I'm suddenly ramping the speed automatically, and I have the option to lock that waveform to my subdivision. So I could have it so that every quarter note, every whole note, every measure, every 2 measures, whatever it is that I want, this is going from the min to the max of the setting in time or in a various subdivision with the way that everything else is clocking, which is really cool. Really, really cool. Let's talk about the BlueSky. So like I said, the BlueSky is the one thing on this board that I've never had in my studio, let alone ever used before. I own V1s of the El Cap and the Flint. I have borrowed digs for extended periods of time in the past and really, really loved them. This was entirely new to me. So let's go ahead and just kind of like walk through some of the modes. We'll look at the shimmer stuff and talk about why this strikes me as something that feels like it should feel dated in the modern context. First things first, all knobs at noon. I will say, if you've never used one of these before, modulation off, plate, this is less ambient than you're expecting it to be. Like, that is a much shorter plate than the Flint is at that same setting. That's a more ambient plate at noon than this is. But this is also a lot more versatile. You can really kind of like being able to fine tune those low and high parameters across each other. I tend to keep the highs pretty low on this thing because it has just enough resonance in that EQ shelf that it gets really bright. And it still stays remarkably present south of noon, which is really nice because sometimes you want that really present reverb and sometimes you don't. And then you have your pre-delay, a lot more pre-delay on this thing. Let's take it back up. Again, that mix taper is really, really valuable. And so is this modulation. I really like the light modulation on this. I have a lot of appreciation for when somebody gets reverb modulation right in a way that doesn't just sound like they stuck a chorus in the wet loop. Deep sounds a little bit like that, but it kind of skirts my limit. That medium, though, is the truth. But again, that decay gets real tight, like borderline non-existent, all the way up through otherworldly. And this is all on plate still. In this mode, your shimmer is going to be a regenerative octave up, which basically means each pass of that octave feeds back into its effects loop, which means they kind of cascade upwards, and it's not super my jam, but we'll give it a listen anyways. You're gonna hear that runaway effect. Here, we'll turn that high up so you can really hear all of it. Kind of skitters away into the atmosphere until it becomes like dog whistly. But again, it's not so much shimmer's never been for me really. But that is for me. Let's jump down to the room, which is my go-to thing in here. I find that pairing a plate here and a room here can get you a long way in terms of like really comprehensive, complex reverb sounds. And this room sounds great. I expected to see a hall or something in here because, once again, I kind of assumed this was like a big ambient reverb. But, you know, there's so many sounds in here that are very... Like, it's a very, like, legit room, especially if you dampen those highs down a little bit. Just for really effectively bolstering, like, a delay line. But then can get really, really beautifully big. Like, I don't know who could deny that that's a really great sounding reverb. And it's not too much. Like, it's well tuned, it's appropriate, It's not something crazy. I really like it. I think it's a really, really good reverb, and I can't believe I've never played one. Okay, on this version, you have your shimmer control as fifths and octaves, still regenerative. And still entirely not my vibe. Maybe I just don't know how to use shimmer. I'm totally open to that being a possibility. But it is not for me. And thirdly, you have a spring. Yep, it's a spring. Don't get me wrong, there's a sound in there. But here's the thing I want to highlight about the spring on this thing, and that is the one good shimmer mode, I should say, in my opinion. As you bring this shimmer up on the spring specifically, you start to hear that there's a pulsating, it's a octave down with a tremolo. And as you go past noon, it speeds up the trem. Which I think is really, really cool. And again, one of the things that I really love here is I could just favorite that one thing and then worry about my knob position for my live mode. But on this thing, you have quick access to my medium sound, and my big sound. And that is the BlueSky. Okay, we're here at the home stretch now, so let's now deliver some verdicts. We're going to talk about each of these pedals individually, whether or not the update is worth it, and kind of give my parameters by which I am judging each of them as we go. First up is the El Cap, which I think is the most obvious thumbs up by this is a very worthwhile update. Even if you're not a MIDI user, that toggle switch for mono stereo on the back of the pedal and the relocating of the spring reverb to its own knob, those are huge wins. This is just a great overall quality of life improvement on a beloved classic circuit. But if you're a MIDI user, this is the best pedal purchase you're going to make this year, in my opinion. Being able to get from your standard go-to delays to that sound-on-sound looper, that amazing lo-fi modulator, without having to reach down and touch a single knob. Being able to do that in a live set is huge. Being able to MIDI clock your El Cap is such a big win. The old El Capistan doesn't even have external tap. You don't even have to be a MIDI user. You can just buy this because you can finally run external tap to it without having to get it modded. Second up is the Dig for a lot of the same reasons. I think the new knob configuration is really, really valuable. I think being able to access things like that chorus sound if you don't use a chorus pedal, but sometimes you just are in a pinch and you want it. Being able to reorder your delays from that series to the parallel to the ping pong all on the fly and not having to go into those submenus is really, really valuable. The presets on it, the Dig does so much that being able to access those different delay configurations via MIDI, whether it be presets or just CC changes, is really, really enticing. If you're not a MIDI person, I'm gonna put this one in the kind of maybe category. If you've never played a Dig, just separately, I highly recommend that you get either the old one or the new one because it's just such a good digital delay. And now we're getting down to our reverbs. We bunched them together in the video and we're gonna bunch them together here as well. If you're like me and you reach for the Flint way more than you ever expected to because that plate and that 80s haul are just so dialed in, this is a big one for me because I use probably 2 reverb sounds live in any given setting. Occasionally I'll need a third, but it's pretty rare. I usually want that rhythm guitar plate sound and that big washy hall sound. And the Flint does both those things better than almost anything I've used. And so being able to MIDI in those 2 sounds is a big win. Being able to MIDI clock that tremolo alongside that is also a really, really big win. But the V1 Flint, it has external tap for trem or a favorite switch, so you could still do that with an analog tap to access those things. So I'm gonna say if you're not a MIDI person, I have great news. V1 Flint's probably just got a lot cheaper on reverb, and I would maybe recommend checking one of those out. But if you're MIDI curious at all, go this route. This is a really good pedal. And lastly, the BlueSky, the kind of classic Strymon effect. If you like shimmer, this is the obvious one. Like those 3 shimmer modes, if you're into shimmer, are great, especially that spring one. That spring one is menacing and cool and weird, and you're not gonna get it off of this pedal, which is, you know, worthwhile. It's not nothing, and you won't get it in the V1 as far as I'm aware. But talking MIDI and everything else, I really like that the BlueSky has that built-in favorite switch. It does dampen the like, do you need MIDI for this side of things? But I'm gonna say it's very similar to the Flint. If you're not a MIDI person, the V1, or sorry, I should say if you're not a MIDI person and if you're not a shimmer person, that V1 probably works out really well. But I haven't played it, so I can't actually vouch for it. This one I have played, and I do know that it sounds great. So yeah, I would put the Flint and the BlueSky in the, if you like MIDI, get these. The Dig a little bit above that, and the El Cap as the like obvious, why would you not have this in your studio already? I think that about does it. This has been exhaustive. I hope you have found it useful, enjoyable, or something. Let me know in the comments if you have any of these, how you would rate them in terms of the worthwhile updates. Thank you for sticking it out to the end with me here, and I'll see you next time.